So I'm inclined to get started. More people can ping in as they join. Is that okay for my panelists? All right, great. Thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate your time. And this is an important time in America for racial justice. And that's relevant today. African Americans and people of color are disproportionately targeted by for-profit colleges and disproportionately enroll. So our research team ran the numbers over the last 48 hours, and a full 60% of for-profit college students are people of color, significantly higher than public or nonprofit colleges. And the African American percent goes higher when you look only at the older independent students and veterans. So oversight of predatory colleges matters now more than ever. We are very pleased to partner with the Century Foundation and Bob Shireman, who's been a longtime leader. I'm going to turn it over right now to our state policy manager, Raymond Curtis, who's going to MC, and he'll explain some of the technology.
Great, thank you so much, Carrie, and welcome everyone. First, I want to start with introductions of our panelists who will be speaking and presenting certain sections of our toolkit. To start, we have Bob Shireman. He is the Director of Higher Education Excellence at the Century Foundation and former official of both the Obama and Clinton administrations. And just speaking is Carrie Wofford. She's the president and founder of Veterans Education Success, and she previously held senior policy posts in the US Senate and several policy roles in the 1990s Clinton administration. She also worked as an attorney at Wilmer & Hale. We also have Bob Norton with us today, and he is the Senior Advisor to Veterans Education Success and the President of the Maryland Military Coalition. Bob is a Vietnam veteran and a career soldier with 28 years of service. After that service, Bob served 20 years as an advocate in the Military Officers Association of America, where he was a Director of Government Relations for Veterans Benefits, Healthcare, and Reserve and Guard issues. We also have Stephanie Hall from the Century Foundation, where she is a fellow, and she works on higher education policy. Stephanie previously worked at the University System of Maryland Office of Academic and Student Affairs on issues including teacher education and workforce development. My name is Raymond Curtis, as Carrie mentioned. I'm the State Policy Manager for Veterans Education Success. I'm also a U.S. Army combat veteran and a recent graduate of Columbia University, where I served in the University Senate and as the Policy Advisor to the President of Columbia. Now, I want to go over a few quick things that, like Carrie mentioned. First, you'll see the camera where it shows me up at the top of your screen up here. You can maximize that if you'd like to make it bigger. Just drag it down from the corner and you should be able to do that if you're in full screen mode. There is a Q&A button that you've probably seen down at the bottom. You can interact with that as we're presenting. Type questions as we see them. Folks will answer them from the panel. You can like questions, you can comment on questions. Please feel free to interact there. You also have a raise hand option. There may come times where somebody says, raise your hand if you've ever done this. Feel free to click on that and be as interactive as you'd like. If you lose audio, please just exit out of the room and then click back on to the link that you have to re-enter the room, and that should fix all of that. By the way, that goes to the panelists as well. We will have a Q&A at the end, where you'll be able to unmute and interact with us, the panelists. All right. So first up, we have Bob Shireman. Bob's going to talk a little bit about why we need to focus on the for-profit college industry.
Thank you, Raymond. So enrolling in college involves an enormous amount of trust. Trust that the school will deliver what you expect as a student. Trust that the curriculum and the teaching is a good match for you as a student. You may have a sense of that, but you also rely on the school telling you that it thinks that you're right for the program. It may, in many cases, it will know better, should know better. Abuse of that trust is far more common at for-profit colleges than at public or nonprofit schools. In fact, of the fraud complaints filed by student loan borrowers, who are across all types of schools, more than 98% of those fraud complaints concern for-profit schools. A repeating history of manipulative recruiting and low-quality, overpriced courses, especially during recessions, makes this issue particularly important right now when demand is going to be high for routes into jobs while we have high unemployment rates. The purpose of this toolkit is to help states protect consumers against a repeat of those patterns.
Hey, great, thank you, Bob. And next up we have Carrie Wofford again, and Carrie's going to talk a little bit about early warning signs and how states can better protect students from troubled and failing institutions.
Thank you. And Raymond, did you mean to skip over the slide about Maryland?
I did not, excuse me. I apologize. It is not Carrie's turn, everyone. Bob Shireman is first going to share some major legislative wins based on some of the recommendations that are in the toolkit.
Or Bob Norton, either Bob.
Yeah, we've got two Bobs here, so it could get a little confusing. But thank you, Raymond, and thanks everybody for participating today. Shown on this slide are 3 big wins in the state of Maryland this year during the past session. And one of the important recommendations from our discussion today is that we believe the state of Maryland's historic legislative action can be replicated in other states. As shown on the slide, there are 3 major provisions in Maryland's new law, the first of its kind in the nation. In a few moments, Raymond will cover the 90-10 issue on the first bullet. Later, Bob Shireman, this time, the man from the Shire, will address the challenges involved when for-profit schools convert to nonprofit status, the second change in Maryland's law. And then the third law change in Maryland requires an orderly process to oversee school closures in the interest of all students. Later in our discussion, I will speak a bit more on how and why Maryland's historic win for veterans came to pass and what that can mean for other states. Next, Carrie will cover early warning signs in troubled schools. Carrie?
Thank you. And just for the benefit of, I saw some names pop up after we had started, so just for the benefit of others, one reason that this matters more now than ever is something that I mentioned at the beginning that our research team just finished crunching the numbers on, which is that African Americans and people of color are disproportionately targeted by for-profit colleges and disproportionately enroll at for-profit colleges. And a full 60% of for-profit college students are people of color, significantly higher than public or nonprofit. And those numbers go, the African American percent goes even higher when you look only at older independent students or veterans. So what can states do? Well, it turns out that there is 2 easy things states can do. One is, and they're common sense, one is pay attention and recognize the early warning signs of trouble at schools. And the second is ensure orderly closures if schools do close. We can predict that college closures are coming. The reality of the pandemic and the recession is hitting colleges hard. They have the full costs of faculty, they have extra costs for online platforms, and at the same time, they're facing tuition refunds. In our toolkit, we link to some longer papers. We have a long paper on our website, a research paper about early warning signs, and we do 6 case studies. You may remember when Corinthian colleges closed. Before it, and when they closed, the doors were locked, students showed up, they couldn't get their transcripts, they couldn't get their money, they had no access to any of their records. They were locked out, literally. But that sudden closure was presaged by clear warning signs. 22 attorneys general had opened investigations. The California Attorney General had filed suit and documented ways in which Corinthian had completely defrauded students, including having their recruiters pose as Pentagon advisors and write in their email address, Pentagon advisor. The education department had put the schools on heightened cash monitoring and were requiring larger letters of credit. And the company itself had filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission that it faced a possibility of bankruptcy. California and Virginia state approving agencies, these are the state-based arm of the GI Bill oversight effort. So GI Bill is overseen by the federal Department of Veterans Affairs and state Veterans Affairs offices. So the California and Virginia state Veterans Affairs offices in the fall of 2014 looked at the Education Department's concerns and rescinded GI Bill participation. This halted new GI Bill enrollments and saved about 1,400 current GI Bill students from continuing to waste their GI Bill benefits for another 6 months. The other students across the country, of course, showed up and found the doors locked. That was acting on those early warning signs. And this is all we're saying. It's very common sense and should be easy to do. ITT Technical Institute, another great example. Everybody locked out, huge problem nationwide, students stranded, but there were so many early warning signs. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the Securities and Exchange Commission had both filed lawsuits against ITT Tech for predatory practices, including a private loan scheme that was illegal. The accreditor had put them on show cause. Only the California Veterans Affairs Office tried to suspend ITT. The others did not work. We have here on the slide some of the early warning signs that are easy to use. Accreditors, state regulators, the Federal Education Department, other federal agencies, law enforcement, great one, and student complaints. Rainbow, you click to the next slide, please. So what can states do? They can strengthen their oversight and monitoring by state regulatory agencies and install processes for sharing information. Often the other state government offices are just down the hall. So the state Veterans Affairs Office overseeing the GI Bill and the state higher education oversight body are often just down the hall. Simply you need them to talk to each other and alert each other about problems. The other thing that you can do is require schools to report in accreditor actions and regulatory actions and report in outcomes data. When states start paying attention to the data and start paying attention to the problems, they can act quickly. Then, of course, if a school does close, you don't want the students locked out. So you can act now to put in place an orderly school closure requirements, requiring access to transcripts, requiring a process that gives students a path forward, a teach out plan. Maryland passed this law, and we would be happy to share with other states the Maryland model.
Great, thank you, Carrie. Next we're going to be talking about the 90-10 loophole. So I'm going to talk to you about closing the 90-10 loophole. This is a loophole that impacts scores of student veterans in every state. So first, raise your hand if you've ever heard of the 90-10 loophole. Let's see what we look like here. All right, yeah. Neat, I get to see everyone raising hands. All right, good. Yeah, so I'll give a quick background on the 90-10 loophole and then share about what states can do to protect veterans in their state. Under the Higher Education Act, for-profit colleges are allowed to bring in up to 90% of their revenue from the U.S. Department of Education financial aid programs. But at least 10% has to come from other sources like students and families, employers, and private businesses and private scholarships. The 90-10 rule is supposed to be a market viability test. If these schools are providing a quality education product, people other than the federal government should be willing to pay for it. But because the law is written so that only federal funding from the Department of Education counts towards the 90% cap, other federal funding for higher ed goes towards the 10% bottom line, including billions in tuition benefits for veterans from the GI Bill and Department of Defense. Basically, the 90-10 loophole puts a bullseye on the backs of student veterans who are disproportionately targeted by predatory colleges. And these schools are using aggressive recruiting tactics as well, and even commit fraud to convince veterans to enroll, bringing with them tuition benefits that allow the institution to fill its 10% quota for other sources of revenue. So this means that an institution could be getting all its revenue from the federal government sources while still technically complying with the 90-10 rule. And the worst part is these institutions tend to deliver subpar outcomes for students. Out of the 10 schools receiving the most GI Bill, for example, the most GI Bill money that is, in 2018, 8 were for-profit schools, so taxpayers are hurt too. The U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs Inspector General estimates that $2.3 billion will be wasted over the next 5 years in GI Bill payments to colleges that should never have been approved, especially colleges using deceptive recruiting to convince veterans to enroll, like the University of Phoenix and Career Education Corporation. Both of those for-profit schools were also recently informed by the VA that they will lose their access to VA benefits if they do not take corrective action to end their deceptive and misleading recruitment tactics against veterans. So what can states do? First, they can regulate for-profit school licensure and require institutions to meet the intended 90-10 rule if they're applying for a license to enroll students. We passed this law in Maryland just last March. Oregon State Legislature remains very in support of the 90-10 loophole closure, state version, and have already drafted a new legislative concept that will be introduced in 2020 session. California is also considering reintroducing a 90-10 loophole closure bill in 2021. Second, there's the state approving agencies, SAAs, which are the state agencies that process institutional approval for colleges and career schools. Colleges and career schools to enroll students using the GI Bill. So they can require adherence to the 90-10 rule in order to receive approval for VA benefits. Now, both of these options close the 90-10 loophole at the state level, and both are very viable options, one of which is already enacted in the state of Maryland. Now we will move on to Stephanie, and she's going to discuss the importance of requiring minimum spending on instruction for students.
Thanks, Raymond. So school spending habits can give us a view into its priorities and intentions. And most colleges devote a majority of the tuition money they collect from students to actually educating and supporting those students. Some colleges even spend more on teaching than they collect from student tuition. And community colleges are a good example of that. They keep tuition low while also receiving state and local subsidies. At the other end of the spectrum, though, there are some colleges, and most of them are for-profit, that spend less than 30% or even less than 10% of tuition funds on instruction. We have a tool on the Century Foundation website where you can look up the instructional spending of individual schools. And Veterans Education Success released a detailed analysis of spending by colleges that are major recipients of GI Bill funds. That analysis showed that some of the top destinations for enlisted and veteran students spend the least on instruction. So those bottom of the barrel schools, as they called them. 2 schools that have been at the center of FTC actions in the past year for deceptive recruiting of military students, Colorado Technical University and American Intercontinental, they both spend less than 10% of tuition money on instruction. So these bottom of the barrel schools, they invest heavily in marketing, advertising, and recruiting new students rather than supporting the students they've already enrolled. And the federal government does not currently impose restrictions on the things that schools do with the tuition money they collect. So states can address this problem by hinging their approval on a minimum investment in instruction. Maine lawmakers took one approach to this by passing a law that requires for-profit schools to meet certain standards of quality. And part of that includes a stipulation that half of the school's spending must be on instruction. Another approach is again at the state approving agency level. So the agencies that oversee schools approved for GI Bill, they can also require a similar minimum investment in instruction. I'll hand it back over to you, Raymond.
Thank you very much. And really quickly, so I think I have an extra minute from my time. I want to answer a question that was in the Q&A. Again, for those who came late, in the Q&A section, you can submit questions and any of us can answer. It was a question about state grant programs and where do they apply in the 90-10 rule. So to answer this and the other questions, like this can go on and on, anything that isn't Title IV student aid, so Pell Grants, government subsidized student loans, counts towards the, or can be counted towards the 10%. Correct me if I'm wrong, Carrie.
You're right.
Right. Excellent. Very good. So now we have Bob Shireman again to talk about the risk of for-profit to nonprofit conversion and what states can do to protect the integrity of nonprofit institutions.
Raymond. So it's useful to think about public versus for-profit versus nonprofit as sort of like a genetic difference, an alteration in the DNA or the command center of an organization, leading to differences in the behavior of those organisms, these colleges. Publics and nonprofits tend to be tamer in the way that they treat students, more inclined to put a priority on instructional quality and research, in contrast to for-profits, which are focused more squarely on the financial bottom line. A for-profit is driven toward questions like, is there a way we can bring in more money? And is there a way to spend less? Nonprofits are required, in contrast, to put all of their revenue back into the educational enterprise as judged by a board without a financial interest, and students get the benefit of that. Now, because the nonprofit and public labels have been meaningful and important to customers and in oversight, indicating better value or quality, some for-profit operators have been looking for ways that they can get that label, but still profit from the operations in the same way that they have as for-profit enterprises. Now, historically, being nonprofit has been, the legitimacy of that has been monitored and enforced by the IRS because of tax deductions that apply. So they had a reason to monitor that. That oversight by the IRS started collapsing about a decade ago. And over time, the IRS has been doing, in recent years, has been doing very little monitoring. This has allowed an opening for for-profit operators to basically get a nonprofit label on a shell corporation, contract with them as for-profits, and basically operate claiming to be nonprofit when they're actually a for-profit school. States can address this problem by carefully reviewing any conversions of for-profit schools to nonprofit, such as a proposal that is in the California legislature, or by going the approach that Maryland took in its new law, which prompts a state agency review of any financial transactions at any nonprofit, any claimed nonprofit, that involved the trustees, the boards, and executives of those colleges. So we have a couple of good examples. We are, of course, also at the same time doing what we can to try to bring back IRS and federal oversight, but better to have states looking at the problem as well. I'll just note that there is a GAO report expected sometime soon on this topic, so it is ripe for state action as well as federal. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Bob. Now we have Stephanie back. She's going to talk a bit about what states can do to protect students from predatory and unfair contracts.
Thanks. Yeah, so many for-profit colleges require students to sign what are known as enrollment contracts, and these often limit students' rights to take action should they have complaints. And students are at risk when these contracts include what's called forced arbitration clauses. These clauses prevent them from going to court to resolve complaints. Rather than going to court, students are forced to take their complaints to an arbitrator in a private process that rarely ends well for the consumer, and the consumer in this case is the student. Some states fund for-profit colleges through public grant programs, and these states have more leverage than others to limit the use of arbitration clauses. So states that allow some of their public money to flow to for-profit schools could exclude those that mandate arbitration in their enrollment clauses from participating in their funding programs. A new law in Virginia took that approach. So in that new law, it goes into effect next month, institutions that include mandatory arbitration clauses in enrollment contracts are not eligible to receive state aid. Our toolkit online has a complete list of the states that could find this option as a route in. Thanks, Raymond.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. And now moving on, we're going to talk a little bit about reciprocity agreements. Raise your hand if NC-SARA is confusing to you and it's difficult to tell what has changed and what hasn't. what does it mean? Who's, we know who's a part of it, but if it just seems like this unattainable system and not knowing it's a pretty common feeling all across everything. So to help simplify it in terms of what we want to do in states, I'm going to hit some key areas. So reciprocity agreements, they can be very important tools to streamlining oversight and promoting growth and opportunity, but only if the specific terms of the agreement are sufficiently comprehensive. Take driver's license, for example. It's very useful that there is a state agreement that I can drive with my state driver's license from Arkansas in the state of New York. However, if I break New York law, it doesn't matter if it's not against the law in Arkansas. New York gets to decide what laws I have to follow if I'm driving. It makes perfect sense, and it makes it to where I don't have to get a license in every state. So with NC-SARA, that kind of highlights the most relevant issue, which is how branch campuses are overseen for the states that are a part of NC-SARA. By the way, all 49 states, all states except for California are a part of NC-SARA. So basically, NC-SARA is trying to dictate who has authority to govern online programs for multi-state entities. That's, enrolling students in multiple states. It is currently unclear if states that are members of NC-SARA have the authority to regulate out-of-state institutions that enroll online students in their state. So if a school is located in Arizona and enrolls an online student living in Oregon, the institution may only be required to follow the Arizona state law. So the obvious problem is that states should maintain the authority to regulate higher education institutions operating and enrolling students within their state. It just makes sense. Now, as the flaws in NC-SARA are getting exposed, positive change is slowly being made. For example, institutions are now required to make reasonable efforts to ensure that licensures are correct for the region. And graduates will be able to work where they live, even if the school isn't based there. State level advocates and elected leadership will play an important role in continuing that change, though, if we want to continue to see it grow and progress. One of the lessons learned is the importance of ensuring reciprocity agreements. We don't want to end up harming the very people we're trying to help, the citizens. But we can also be a lot more active and we can press for change in the current reciprocity agreement. People can and should be reaching out to NC-SARA staff and leadership, leadership and regional compacts who are supposed to be representing the states. Now, they're supposed to be telling NC-SARA, those compacts, those regional compacts, what the states want, and they aren't currently doing that. Now, it would also be very valuable for AG office and regulatory offices in states to come together to address this problem. AGs need to be much more engaged if we hope to improve NC-SARA so it benefits the states and the students rather than high cost, low quality online education programs, in a nutshell. So that's the primary issue with NC-SARA right now. So moving forward from there, we've got Carrie to talk to us about how states can better inform people about how to find the right school for them.
Thank you. So you can see here an ad. This was a public service announcement type ad run by the city of New York. And I don't know if you can make out what she's saying, but she says, these are personal stories. So she says, I saw an ad for a school to learn how to become an ultrasound technician. I learned nothing. The school said I'd get lifetime job placement, but when I asked for help, I didn't get any. I honestly believe my degree doesn't count for anything. I wish I had gone to a community college, which cost a lot less. And that's Nicole. So New York City did a Know Before You Enroll campaign. And on 1 out of every 5 subway cars and buses in the city of New York, they had these personal first-person story ads. And what the New York City director of the program had done is she had consulted with psychologists in the city of New York who informed her that the best way to warn citizens, consumers about problems isn't by lecturing them, but by giving them a first-person story that they can relate to. So that's what New York did, and they were very effective. They had them in multiple languages and multiple stories. This is an example of one of the easy and fun items in the toolkit that states can do. Helping people know before you enroll. Give students the information so they can make an informed college choice. Too often students are signing up without knowing that there's a difference in cost, without knowing what the debt is of students who graduate, without knowing, do people who graduate from this school get jobs? Do they earn more than a high school graduate? Is there any return on investment? So New York City was a great example. There's other examples too. The U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs collaborated with us, and I see Matthew Boulay on the phone, hello, who very much helped us with this. This is about 5 years ago. The Department of Veterans Affairs collaborated with us by highlighting some of the veterans we helped who'd been cheated out of their GI Bill. And so they had they tell their stories. And they created a Know Before You Go video. And it's on the VA website. When you're looking at how to use your GI Bill, you can watch this video. They put it up pretty prominently. Another great example that's out there for states and states can use the VA video. States can also use this new video that the USAA Educational Foundation put out. It's unbranded, meaning doesn't say who made it. And it's available for public use. It's in the toolkit. And it shows websites that appear to be legitimate, good websites that you might rely on when you're picking a college. And then it says, these look like legitimate websites, but guess what? They're not. They cheated people and ripped them off. So there's really good sources out there that cities and states can use right now to create their own public education campaign. The second thing that states can do is gather data. So in California passed a law in 2019, which will match wage data from their employment database to college data on enrollment and debt and repayment. That kind of data can help states establish standards for what amount of student debt compared to graduate earnings is an appropriate use of taxpayer resources. What's the ROI that you want to see before you're willing to have taxpayer money go there? This will sound familiar to those of you who know federal policy, who are familiar with the gainful employment rule. But the first step is get the data in-house and make the data public. Let students be able to make a decision. The second step would be then take government action based on bad return on investment. So these are a number of the great ideas in the toolkit. The toolkit has details, has footnotes on everything, has links. And now I pass it back to Raymond.
Hey, thank you, Carrie. And finally, we'll have Bob Sharman to share some resources that we should all be taking advantage of at the state and local levels.
Thanks, Raymond. Just moving state policy, consumer protection does run into opposition from the industry. But you can improve the likelihood of success in legislature or state regulatory actions by working with other stakeholders like student and faculty organizations, college admissions organizations. You may know about NACAC, National Association for College Admissions Counseling. There are state and regional components of that organization that are, we found them to be great partners in this kind of work. And then there are consumer organizations that work on everything from auto safety to mortgages, and they can be great partners as well. And we'll know a lot of the right committees and organizations that could be involved. And I wanted to turn it over to Bob Norton to talk about veterans, who have been one of the best partners for us.
Thanks, Bob. So,
Bob, you muted. You must have pressed a button. You're still muted.
there we go. There, how's that?
Great.
Okay, thank you, Bob. So here on this slide is an example of one of many products that the Maryland Military Coalition put together in support of the Maryland 90-10 legislation. This happens to be a letter to Governor Larry Hogan, the well-respected governor of the state of Maryland, urging him on behalf of the 17 organizations of the coalition to sign into law the 90-10 bill that had cleared both chambers. Maryland's historic victory came about due to a confluence of policy coordination, stakeholder collaboration, as Bob Shireman talked about, and legislator leadership. In this case, Veterans Education Success supplied the intellectual muscle on the 90-10 bill. Some of you may know, but I suspect many don't, that last year's 90-10 bill in Maryland was extremely defective in a number of respects, and it was easily overcome by the education industry. The new version and the important background rationale amped up the potential for success in the session. Important stakeholders worked together, including the Maryland Attorney General's Office, the Maryland Consumer Rights Commission, and the Maryland Military Coalition. On behalf of the MMC, I was on a number of planning calls with Raymond, along with the Deputy Attorney General, Chris DeMaio, and the Maryland Consumer Rights Commission. So we tried to sort of fine-tune our collaborative approach to how we wanted to attack this problem and maximize the potential for success. A key moment was when Senator Pinsky, the chairman of the Education Committee, and the bill sponsor, Maryland Senator Ellis, held a press conference in the Capitol Rotunda in Annapolis before the key committee hearing. My vice president of the Maryland Military Coalition was in fact the key speaker at that press conference, and frankly, he conducted the entire press conference, giving the bill the strong backing of Maryland's veterans. The Maryland Coalition represents collectively about 1 out of every 4 veterans in the state of Maryland. So there roughly are 450,000 veterans, a high percentage of the population, and about 1 out of 4 veterans are represented in the coalition. The coalition testified at every hearing, and thanks to Raymond, we in the coalition were extremely well prepared to face any questions that came up and any objections and any points, misleading points that were raised by industry at the various hearings. Just backing up a little bit, I want to point out that this past session in Annapolis, the biggest policy issue overall for the House of Delegates was investing in Maryland's education system, K through 12. That bubbled upwards to the college level, including the issue of refunding and fully funding Maryland's historically Black colleges and universities, as well as looking at the overall issue of protecting Maryland students. So that was an important background, I'll call it underlying current in the state of Maryland. But putting all these things together, the activists from the Maryland Military Coalition, representing those 17 military groups, the policy folks, my partners in crime at the Veterans Education Success, and other stakeholders came together to make this happen. And we believe that the Maryland experience can be replicated. Sure, it would have to be adapted from state to state, but we believe that it can be replicated in many other states. And in fact, we are working on that going forward in states like Oregon and California and other states to see if we can make continued progress across the nation. So thank you for that. And I'll turn it back over to Raymond.
All right, great. Thank you. That is all we have for you for this presentation. I'll get out.
Oh, we're gonna open up everyone's mics, right?
Yes, and so the way I want to do this, okay, so The way that we'll be doing this is taking questions one at a time. You can now use your, if you want to like speak or engage, use your raise hand and I will unmute you and allow you to talk. If you just want to type your question, feel free to type it in the Q&A area. And folks monitor that, other attendees, please monitor that. You may see a question asked that you also want to ask, and you can just like that and show us that there's a lot of desire to get that one answered.
Raymond,
right?
do you want to put the speaker screen back on you? The other thing I was going to say is that we really appreciate your help, all of you, and coming. And we would love to hear your feedback. You're our friends and family, and we're getting ready to pitch these ideas to state government. And we'd love to hear, you know, our friends and family tell us this part was strong, this part wasn't clear, any feedback you have, and certainly any substantive questions.
Yes, 100%. And what I'll do actually is I'll take this and so now panelists, anytime that you want to speak or answer, just, you know, unmute and start speaking and the camera should switch to you. It's for some reason. Well, I'll just manage it from here. Either way, yes, what we can do is raise your hand if you have a question, or there we go, we have a typed question here. And I can read it aloud. Can you talk about the interactions between college price and quality? Does a high price indicate a high quality school, or price gouging? Does a low price indicate low quality? Basically, why is college pricing so confusing for students and families to understand? Let's take that one.
Stephanie, you want to take a first crack? We're happy to help too.
Yeah, I love that question. I think it's part, you know, what comes first, the elite status or the price. And I think that in some cases we have schools that are able to set their tuition price very high because of their status. And there may also be cases where setting the tuition price high is believed to signal some kind of elite status. So I think that's part of the issue. But when we're thinking about the for-profit predatory college world, the high price is more likely a price gouging issue where the school is more interested in creaming as much profit as they can from whatever resources they take from students, whether it's tuition that they pay out of pocket or it's from federal grant programs. So there is an interaction between college spending and quality, but not necessarily between price and quality. I think that I'd start there and love to hear other people's thoughts on that.
I'll just add, I kind of like the term value. I feel like it maybe hasn't been, people haven't really grabbed onto that much, but it's a good word to kind of take into consideration both. And I think the work that Stephanie's done on instructional spending helps to get at that. You know, are you getting enough instruction for your dollar? Because quality is it's usually you know, a textbook has a certain amount of quality, and if an online course is basically just here's a textbook, read it and take the test at the end of the chapter, that's not everything in the textbook may be accurate, but but if you're paying $10,000 for that, that's not much value. You're not getting a lot of teaching interaction.
And in the GI Bill context, one way that we frame it is, what are the schools charging VA? So schools set their tuition and send a bill to the Department of Veterans Affairs. Now the Department of Veterans Affairs caps it at a certain amount. It's about 25 grand a year, but then they also offer yellow ribbon, which is on top of that. So they cover quite a lot. So what's a tuition that's fair for a school to charge VA? What is it fair to charge the taxpayers? If you as a school are only investing 10%, 8% of your costs into the students, is that fair to send the bill to VA for 90% to spend on TV ads, Ferrari cars, things like that? So we think about it as what are you charging VA and what are you charging the taxpayers? We have some other questions that came in.
Yeah. So we have a couple more questions. I'll switch to Matt Boulay here. Is a couple of questions. Are you targeting particular states? This seems like it should have bipartisan support. Any particular strategies to build bridges across two parties?
Yeah, we totally agree that a lot of what we're pushing for is common sense, bipartisan, shouldn't be problematic. Early warning signs, very reasonable, very common sense. We are excited to be starting in some Midwest states on early warning signs and on some of the others, including 9010, but really heavy push on early warning signs. But we're very interested in doing more in more states. I think it's going to become a question of how thinly spread Raymond and our team gets. But yeah, we're excited about that. And I totally agree that these are very reasonable suggestions.
So another question, you mentioned accreditation as something that state legislators should pay attention to. What if I'm not very familiar with accreditation? What should I be looking for? What exactly should I ask accreditors to provide?
So I think what we're suggesting in the toolkit is simply ask schools, put the burden on schools of having to report in any red flags. And there's a model for this. We passed a law in 2014 that regarding the Pentagon, and it stops the Pentagon from funding with its tuition assistance program, education programs that aren't approved by the education department and that or that don't leave graduates eligible to work in the field. So there are fake law schools in America run by for-profit colleges. There are fake nursing schools. Guess what? You graduate, you can't sit for the bar exam. You graduate from the fake nursing school, you can't become a licensed nurse. There's a huge scam by the for-profit colleges. It's a huge problem. It's gotten a lot of law enforcement attention. And what the Defense Department did was they simply put the burden on schools. So they said schools need to report in attesting that, in fact, their graduates can sit for the licensing exam and proving. So if it's a nursing program, send in the state licensing board list that proves that you're properly accredited. That's a good model of requiring schools to report in. So you take the burden off of government workers. So same thing, states can say, we want schools to report in any accreditor action. If there's accreditor notification, probation, show cause, you immediately need to alert both the state higher education oversight body and the state GI Bill oversight body, which is typically the State Department of Veterans Affairs.
There are a couple of questions in the chat side of things that I'll take a first shot at. One saying that a state agency told them that NC Sarah saves them money, and how would we respond to that? This issue has definitely come up both with regard to NC Sarah and regulation in general, where some of these state agencies are partly funded by fees that schools pay. So you had this odd situation where the state agency almost has an interest in the for-profit schools having higher enrollment, because often the fees are enrollment based. And so they're like, well, if we do a good job enforcing, there will be fewer students enrolling at these schools, and then our agency doesn't get the funding that it needs. I don't know if that's what's happening with this particular. This might be that the agency has expenses in handling complaints, and by having the home state handle the complaints. But in any case, I think it does point to the importance of understanding how an agency is funded and what it sees as the burdens on the agency in terms of its work, and paying attention to that as proposals are developed, whether on reciprocity or on something else, because that definitely comes up in the discussion of the work. The other question is about vocational vocational for-profit schools or all schools. And I'd say generally the things that we're talking about apply to all schools. And we've definitely seen situations where when a state applies things only to non-degree, one set of regulations for non-degree schools versus another set of regulations for degree granting schools, what schools do is whichever one is less onerous in terms of regulation, they'll figure out how can we be a degree granting school. That's what's happened in I think New York and New Jersey, where if you can get one degree program, then you're in that box and suddenly you don't have to comply with everything else. So again, another thing to pay attention to.
Here's another question. Are there examples of NC SARA acting proactively to remove any large online providers for having low quality? Bob or Raymond, do you know about that? Angela's on too, she may know. Angela, I've unmuted you if you'd like to pipe up.
I know it's come up, if we might get Angela here. Some of the financial tests, Laureate, which was Walden, had tried to get in, but then failed on the financial test. It was not quality. One of the issues with NC SARA is they don't really have a quality test. They say that schools have to comply with these guidelines on online education, but no one is actually monitoring or enforcing the guidelines on the quality of online education. And so there has not been any real mechanisms. And that's really one of the issues with NC SARA is it was portrayed as having something to do with as having some kind of additional quality measures, but does not really have anything significant. And fortunately, I'd say that the leadership of NC SARA is thinking about that and trying to figure out how they can do better. So maybe there are some ways that state pressure can bring improvements.
Hi all, I apologize. My mic was not working, but I have restarted it and seems to be working now. Can y'all hear me?
We can.
Hi, Angela.
Hello.
Angela Perry from the Institute for College Access and Success.
Thank you, Carrie. I think Bob answered that pretty succinctly already. There have been some examples of some states that have identified problematic schools and taken steps to limit their enrollment capacity through NC SARA, but because it is a system that relies on states to do all of the oversight, and many of those states are underfunded or don't have the capacity, there are a lot of inconsistencies between how different states have conducted their oversight for NC SARA. I think that's sort of the short version of the answer, is that there are some states that seem to be taking more action than others. And NC SARA, I think, is working on, as Bob said, trying to find ways to create a consistency in those enforcements. It's been a slow process, and it is troublesome for sure.
Raymond, here's an idea. Would you like to just unmute everyone, and then in case it's just 4 minutes left, in case anybody wants to say anything before we leave?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. All right. So everyone, I'm just going to scroll through, and you should get an alert that says you are permitted to unmute. And at your leisure, go ahead and unmute and engage and talk if you'd like.
I'm doing it from the bottom up too, so we'll meet in the middle.
Too bad we can't all sing. The timing difference, just doesn't work.
You have to do a round, Bob.
Oh yeah. Huh.
Yeah, or edit it together later.
So we'd love to hear any final feedback. We really appreciate everybody's time. We hope that you will take a real close look at the toolkit. Great resources, great links to more detailed resources. We'll be sure to send it around to everybody.
This was great.
Yeah, thanks for everyone for coming. Has anyone participated in other webinars like this and might have some experience? This is maybe only my second.
Raymond, if people have feedback that they want to send, is there a email address or how would you like it to be received?
Yeah, everybody should have mine or Carrie's email, I think, and send it to us or to all of us. That's fine as well, and we'll share it around with the team. And it's, yes, very, very, very much appreciated. For those that don't know, it's my first time hosting a webinar, and it was very exciting.
Good job, yay!
You did a great job, and it gets even easier.
Yeah, thank you. I'm hoping. I was all nerves. I've got my little.
Well, thank you all so much for your time. Raymond, thank you for emceeing us. And Colonel Norton, we love you. We appreciate your many decades of leadership. Bob Shireman and Stephanie, we're so glad to collaborate with you and so grateful for your expertise and insights. And thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your week.
Thanks all.
Thanks for all your hard work.